Welcome to Casual Friday. So I've got some project updates and just some other things going on in my knitting and even my spinning life. And if you want to jump from one point to another in this podcast, you can find links to each section down in the description. So I've been working on this Edwardian sweater for a few months now, and the entire reason that I knit this sweater was so I could understand how the construction method works. I never had any intention of wearing this sweater. I'll try it on, but I just don't see myself ever actually wearing it anywhere. But I wanted to understand how it worked. I am back to working on it, and I've seamed up the sides and the sleeves, and one of the sleeves has been set into the armhole, and I'm about to do the other one, and then I'll have to do those front closures with buttons or snaps. Still not 100% sure how I'm going to do that, but I wanted to give an overhead review of what the construction process was and how this sweater is so different from other sweaters in many respects, and then just walk you through the challenges that I have had and am having and will have going forward. All right, so here's the sweater so far. I have seamed the sides together, so I have an armhole on this side, and I have and I've actually seamed the sweater in, or the sleeve in, on this side. And it was kind of I kind of stalled on doing it because I just wasn't sure how I could do it and still make sure that I was maintaining these accordion pieces and this look, because although I have set in many sleeves over the years, I have never set in a sleeve that had a stitch pattern like this, or that had a sleeve that was so much bigger in circumference than the armhole. So let me show you what I mean. So here's the armhole. Well, first of all, let's go through all of the challenges. Let's review how this sweater is constructed. First of all, I cast on down here on the back right here, and then as I worked the back straight for a little while, and then I started doing increases for a while. I don't know if I did increases all the way. Looks like I did increases all the way up to where the armhole is formed. And then I did something that I hadn't done before with a sweater back, and that was to only do some decreases. So a little bit of decreases, maybe an inch. You'd lose about an inch worth of stitches. And so a decrease on every right side row on each side. There was no binding off at this point, and that was what was unusual. Typically, you would bind off for an inch to inch and a half, and then you might have this line of decreases. So that was unusual to me. Then after I did the decreases, then I worked straight up to here. So at this point, I was at the top of the back, and I knit across the shoulder, and then I bound off the center stitches for the back of the neck, and then I continued to knit the second shoulder. And from this point, I knit the shoulder for about an inch and a half. They described everything in terms of the repeats. How many of these repeats I was to be working, and I think I had to work 1.5 of those, something like that, maybe something like that. So I did that, and then I had to cast on as many stitches. If you look at how wide this is here, I had to cast on as many stitches as I had for the back. So just for this one right front, I had to cast on all of these stitches. And of course, this fabric kind of acts like an accordion. And so then I knit down to the armhole, and then I cast on enough stitches. I cast on all of these stitches. So what this means is this is the entire underarm, but the seam that connects the back to this piece of fabric is at the edge of this span of stitches. So the back seam is not centered up the underarms. It comes up the edge of the back, and then all of the fabric needed to span the width of the body is formed by casting on stitches here. So that is really different. And there was no shaping, there was no like gradual increases here, like there were decreases at the back. That didn't happen on the front. It just straight down and then cast on. So then I worked straight down the front. Remember there were increases back here on the back, but the front, it was just straight down until I got to this length right here. So the entire length of the side, I worked straight, and then, but you can see how this is so much longer here. So then I started working a series of short rows. So I worked all the way across to here first, and then on this piece, every time I did a wrong side row, I'd come a little bit shorter, and so I could knit a whole bunch of extra rows. This part is the longest. So then I finished all my short rows, and then the task was to decrease out a bunch of stitches because we have so much extra fabric here. The width is really extra. And so I was instructed to do decreases in 3s and 4s until I was down to a certain number. So I had to try to figure out what to do. And I worked straight across for a little bit. I didn't do any decreases right in the front, and then I did a bunch of decreases all the way across. And I wasn't really worried about how they were going to show because the whole thing, everything's blousing over. And I wanted to just work the instructions as they were written in order to see what would happen. There were some times when I maybe modified an instruction because I knew things would be easier for me later if I did, like working the selvage stitch in stockinette so that when I seamed it, that would be easier rather than working it in pattern all the way to the edge. So that's how the front was, and then I came back to this shoulder, worked it for 1.5 inches or however many repeats it told me to do, and then I cast on again for here as many stitches as the whole thing is wide, and did the same thing, casting on stitches in the underarm, working straight, then doing short rows. So the thing that puzzled me, the thing that caused me to make this sweater was to understand how the front was to be closed, because the instructions are to put ribbon on the back side of the fabric. So this is the right side of the fabric, this is the wrong side of the fabric. So to put ribbon on the back side, and then I'm supposed to put buttons on one side and buttonholes on the other. And that was what I didn't understand, is how I could do that when both ribbons were on the back side of the work. Because if you wanted to overlap them like this, like you would normally do for a sweater, putting a ribbon on the back side of this and not telling me where buttonholes would be isn't really so helpful. Like if I have a button, if I'm overlapping like that, that means the button has to be on this face of the fabric, which is the right side of the fabric. And they're telling me to put them on the wrong side of the fabric. Well, once I saw how this was working out with this accordion fabric, then it became obvious to me, if this is the wrong side, this right here, and this is the wrong side, then these two pieces of fabric are facing each other. And that means I could put a button or whatever on this face of the fabric and a buttonhole on this face, and I could button it together that way. Now I had assumed that the button would just be inside the buttonhole between the fabric and the buttonhole. Someone in the vintage group suggested that it would probably be a whole bunch of really tiny buttons, and you would button it through that buttonhole and then through space between the stitches, and then the button would end up over here. So that could be true. What I'm still not sure about, though, is how this bottom part then is going to button together. I still don't know. I don't know if I would just button it together like that, or if I would try to do some kind of overlapping thing here. I still haven't quite figured that out. And then that's going to be a problem for the neck as well. So I have this much neck, and I need to sew it to all of this. So that means there are going to be a number of stitches on this edge will be seamed, like, so at least I'm guessing two stitches on here will be seamed to one stitch on here, about that. I have to count up stitches and try to figure out exactly how to do that, how stretched out this is going to be here. I just don't know. So this is one reason I had to go back and re-knit this on a little bit larger needle, because the original small needles were so tight that it was going to be so hard to have this stretch enough and then not choke me when it was around my neck. So now that you understand that aspect, this armhole here isn't super deep. I think this is about 6 inches deep, and then there's maybe 4 inches across here, so 12. So this might be 16 inches in circumference, 15 to 16, somewhere around 16, give or take a little bit. So here's the sleeve though, and this is a different kind of, a little bit different shape of a set-in sleeve than I've seen before. So this is more like 21 inches in circumference, and this I have to fit into the armhole. And if you sew, you may think, oh, well, you just ease it in, but it's not. Yes, you have to ease it in somehow. The question is, how do you ease it in when you're seaming knitted fabric like this together? So normally you have an armhole like this, and maybe this is, let's say that's 8 inches deep, and then you might have another inch or so right here. Let's say that's 1 inch, just for argument's sake. So then this would be 18 inches in circumference all the way around. And then you would have a set-in sleeve that would have, so your set-in sleeve shaped like this. You have some bind off at the top of the sleeve, and then you have this kind of curved shape like this. So this part right here is the same length as that. So you have these two edges right here are going to be seamed together. And then the 8-inch arm depth right here, armhole depth, this 8 inches, which is 16 when you come up and back down around the armhole on the other side, that is supposed to be the same length as this. And so this gets seamed in to this space. That's the typical thing. And normally what happens is, because the sleeve cap is basically has decreases on either side for a while until you get to the top, and then you may have one row of bind off, or you may have some little staggered bits of bind off like that. But these are these are horizontal edges, and this is a vertical edge. And so most of this gets seamed vertically to this. So you have a row on one side is seamed to a row on that side. So that is what happens for most of that. And then at the top of the armhole, where these are horizontal stitches, this is still vertical. And so you are seaming the heads of stitches to the ends of rows here. So then you have that vertical to horizontal attachment. What's going on in this is that this armhole is very wide. And it was formed by, it was knit in this direction. There were a certain number of stitches that were cast on initially, and then I kept casting on several stitches, so that it's a very horizontal cap. So most of what I have here are horizontal edges that I need to seam into this vertical edge. And that is what ends up being kind of handy, because you always have more rows per inch than stitches per inch. And what I was able to do for most of this sleeve was to seam one stitch to one row. And normally you can't do that because you have a lot more rows than you have stitches. But in this case, it was very close. So that was something I hadn't expected. And so it naturally helped to maintain the accordion nature of this fabric. I didn't have to try to seam multiple stitches to a single row, which is kind of what I thought was going to happen. So one thing I forgot to mention in that overhead was one of the additional challenges of putting this sleeve into the armhole is the fact that that seam on the side is not centered at the underarm. It's off, it's along the back, and therefore that just adds one more element of getting everything pinned in a centered way, because I'm used to lining the center of things up to the sleeve, the seam, and the seam is offset. So and there's no seam at the top of the shoulder since I knit directly over. So that's another challenge, is making sure that that is exactly centered, that the top of the sleeve cap is centered at where the actual top of the armhole is. So there's a couple other extra challenges that I didn't mention. Next week, I am going to be in Kansas City at a conference. I guess it's a conference called PLY Away. It's put on by PLY magazine, and so it's a week of, well, Tuesday to Friday classes and of spinning and spinning related classes, and they have a big marketplace and things like that. So I haven't done any spinning over the winter, and so I was a new spinner to begin with. So what I've been practicing with is this pencil roving. It's called pencil roving because it's quite thin, and instead of some of the roving or top that you buy is quite wide, and you really have to separate strips of the fiber in order to be able to spin it and to do the drafting. And what has been really nice about this is I didn't have to do any of that. It lets me just focus on getting used to spinning again, and I can just spin directly from this giant ball of fiber. So the type of wool this is called Southdown. And I talked a little bit about Southdown sheep last spring when I visited the Oliver Kelly farm just north of Minneapolis here. The Minnesota Historical Society owns this historic farm, and I talked a bit about that farm. And that farm has sort of two farms. They have the new farm and they have the old farm. And the old farm has the animals and the planting practices and the crops that were grown during the time that Oliver Kelly was alive and managing his farm back in the mid-19th century. And so the animals that they have on the old farm are the same types of animals that they would have used or had on the farm back then. And the sheep that they have were Southdown sheep. The new farm has the kinds of farm equipment and the kinds of crops and the types of animals that Minnesota farms currently have. And so the sheep that they have on the new farm are called polypal. The Southdown sheep were, I think, one of the first two types of sheep breeds that were brought here to what is now the United States. And I think they may have been brought in the early 1800s. And so that was the first breed of sheep that was one of the first breeds that was brought here to the US. But it takes a while for these sheep to get full size. And so if you want to use them for breeding, it takes like an extra year before you can breed them. And they only have one lamb per year. So polypal sheep grow really fast, and you can breed them in the fall. Like if they're born in the spring, apparently you could breed them in the fall. I believe that's correct. And because they grow faster, then they can be harvested for lamb meat more quickly as well. So that is true for a lot of modern sheep farmers. Like the sheep breeds that are selected are based on how quickly they can get to full size to be harvested for meat, or how quickly they can be bred, and how many babies they each have. So I've been intrigued by these Southdown sheep because I just found that historical connection to be really interesting. So one of the reasons that I got so interested in the Oliver Kelly farm was that simply because I was looking to expand my horizons in terms of what types of wools that I knit with. And I was really starting to seek out other breeds, just so I could experience what they were like when they were knitting, because I tend to knit with a pretty narrow range of wools. So that was part of that exploration, was learning about that. So then I went to the local sheep and wool festival called Shepherd's Harvest, which is always on Mother's Day weekend. And I went there looking for some different sorts of wools that I might be able to try knitting with. And I really couldn't find yarns, too many yarns that were made from different breeds. Instead, I kept finding fleeces, raw fleeces or prepared fleeces. That was how I could find these different breeds. And that was when I said, oh, okay, well, now I have a good reason to learn to spin, because I'd been avoiding it for more than a decade, actively avoiding learning to spin. So last summer I took spinning classes. I bought a spinning wheel, and I was hardly knitting at all because I was spending so much of my time learning to spin. And one of the things that I heard about and decided to take part in was a retreat in the fall that the Weavers Guild put on. And the Weavers Guild does weaving, spinning, and dyeing. And I had learned from going to the Knitters Guild retreat the year before that was the way I really felt like I had become part of the community, the guild community, and I really was meeting other knitters. And I'd waited so long before I had done that retreat. I didn't want to make that mistake this time. And I thought, well, this is the way I can meet other spinners and learn more about the craft and find out more about what's going on. So I planned last summer I would go to this retreat that the Weavers Guild put on in the fall. And so I went there, and sure enough, I met people. And I met a couple there, a husband-wife couple, who I met him in the lounge, and they found out where I lived, in what part of Minneapolis I lived in. And they're like, oh, we have a weekly knitting group at this library that you should come, and it's on Wednesdays, and you should come. And so I started coming to that weekly knitting group, and I just loved it. Well, then the next day, after I'd met them, the next day, another woman named Celeste came into that lounge and was talking to this couple. And she was a really great storyteller, and it was really fun to listen to her talk. And she's really interesting. And I didn't find out until the next night, when I walked into my cabin, and the adjoining door was open. This was actually a double cabin, and I was in a cabin with a couple other women, and there were people on the other side. I didn't know who they were. The door was open, and there was Celeste in there sitting at the table along with my cabin mates. And so I went over there and spent a couple of hours and talking to her, and then she invited me to her monthly Friday night knitting group. So that was a fantastic opportunity. I've gone to those knitting groups as often as I could. Almost every week. The weather has been a problem this winter. There are a few times I missed knitting group, but I've gone every month to Celeste's Friday night monthly knitting group, and I've had a great time doing that. Well, when I was at that fall retreat, one of the things is they have all these door prizes. They have these drawings. Every time there's a meal, they have a drawing, and everybody's going to win at least one thing. And then they have some additional drawings that work in other ways where you can win other things. So when they finally called my name, I went up there and I looked at what there was, and there was this South Down roving. And I thought, well, that's perfect, because this is sort of the beginning of my journey toward learning to spin. Started with South Down sheep. And so I've had this all winter and haven't done anything with it. And so I decided I really need to start practicing my spinning before I go to the spinning retreat next week in Kansas City. So I've been practicing with that. I met one other person at that retreat, and that was a woman who taught a class I took. I took a spinning class on spinning Angora. And she was talking about it, about this retreat or conference, PLY Away. She was talking about it, and I was asking her questions, and it sounded really interesting. And I said, well, how do you get all of your stuff down there? Because you have to take whatever spinning equipment that you're going to use in the class, you have to take with you. She said, oh, I drive down there. And I said, oh, and she said, the registration's in a couple of weeks. And then she just said, oh, if you decide you want to go, you can come with me when I drive down there. And so I met another woman, and it turns out we have a lot in common. She's also a writer and she writes technical spinning articles. So I'm really looking forward to spending time with her. It just seems like I've had one thing after another has made these connections, and it all started with the Southdown sheep. So as I've been spinning, practicing different spinning things, sometimes as I'm drafting, pulling the fibers apart, they break. And I'm still treadling, and the tail breaks away from the fiber that I'm holding, and the bobbin just keeps spinning around. And that's happened many, many times. I've never had any trouble. I just pull the tail out and start again. And yesterday I could not find it. It was buried in there. And I'd heard about this in the past. I heard about people talking about if the tail gets buried, but I couldn't remember what to do about it. And I tried so many different things on my own, like with my fingernail and trying various things that wasn't working. And so I did a search on a Ravelry group called, I think it's called Beginning Spinners, and searched to see if that question had ever come up. And it had, like 8 years ago, somebody asked the same question. And there were a couple of tips, and the first one worked, so I didn't try the second one. But the two tips were, well, one of them was to take tape and just tap it on here, and then it would pull up the tail. I thought, well, that's a good idea. And the other idea was to take a toothbrush, and so take a toothbrush and kind of run it this way. And I happen to have a package of extra toothbrushes up here upstairs when the tape was downstairs. So I opened up a new package of toothbrushes, and I just ran it across, and I thought, well, that didn't work. And as I pulled the toothbrush away, the tail came up, and I thought, okay, that worked. That was a great tip. So I'm going to remember to always keep a toothbrush in with my spinning tools. One of the things that when I'm writing an article, I always discuss with the editor what colors, they're thinking about for this issue and what color they'd like me to use. And so sometimes they send me yarn. Sometimes if I don't need a lot of yarn, I just have something in my stash I can use, whatever. So, but they had a yarn company send me yarn to knit the swatches for this article. And the yarn came, and I thought, oh, this is nice. It has a very slight halo to it, just not like mohair or angora or anything like that, just slightly floaty bits around. And when I started knitting with it a couple of weeks ago, I was knitting along. I thought, oh my, I love this yarn. And I knew what the brand was. I'd looked at the brand. The brand is called Ancient Arts Yarns. And I knew that they were in Canada because when I got the package, I'd gotten an email that said, you're getting a package from Canada that you have to sign for. I'm like, what did I order from Canada? And I hadn't ordered anything. It was this yarn. So I'm knitting with this yarn. It's a hand-dyed yarn. And it's just beautiful. And it has little bits, just a little bit of color variation. But some of that color variation comes from the fact that there's some very light brown wool mixed in here. So I would see these little flecks of very light brown every so often. And so I thought I have to figure out what is in this yarn. So I found the label. The yarn that I'm using it's a worsted weight yarn. It's called Lascaux. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And the fiber content is, I didn't know how to pronounce the first word, so I'm going to put down here on the screen what the fiber content was. And what I wasn't sure of was whether the thing that was the 25%, if that was a wool. I didn't know if I could tell that Punta Arenas was wool, but I didn't know if the Manx, whatever that was, if that was a wool, because the only thing I'd ever heard of that was called Manx were those tailless cats. That was the only thing. And I'm like, can't be cat fur. And can it? And so I went Googling and I looked up Manx. Turns out it's pronounced Lochtan. I fell in love with these sheep. They have 4 horns. As far as I can tell, they all have one set of curly horns that come down like this. And then the other set of horns gets styled in different ways. It might be another set of curly horns, or it could be a set that just sticks straight up. But whichever, they're just adorable. I mean, they're crazy looking and I love them, but they're that very light brown color. So I wanted to know more about them. And most of all, I wanted to know how to pronounce it, because I do know now it's Manx Lochtan, but I didn't know it. I was like, is it Lofton? Is it Loughton? I had no idea. So I searched around and I found a very short little YouTube video about these sheep. And it was, somebody had gone to this organic sheep farm where they raise these kinds of sheep. And they were talking about it and they were going on and on. They never once said the name of the sheep until about halfway through. Then they mentioned it. And mentioned it's Manx Lochtan. And they come from the Isle of Man, which is off the coast of Great Britain. So there are 3 islands that are crown dependencies. There's Isle of Man, Guernsey, and Jersey. And so Guernsey and Jersey are historically connected to knitting, and specifically machine knitting. So the Jersey knit came from Jersey. And of course, Guernsey and Gansey, those names are related as well. So the Isle of Wight must be something else. But anyway, so those three islands are crown dependencies. They have their own parliaments. They're connected to the Queen of England and the former British Empire, but they're not part of the UK and they're not Great Britain, but they're nearby. So it turns out that Manx Lochtan literally means from the Isle of Man, brown sheep. They have there's a third Gaelic language. There's Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, and then there's Manx Gaelic. So Manx refers to the island of Man, and then Lochtan means essentially brown sheep, and that's where they came from. So they're originally from that island, and sheep are really adaptable, and that's part of the problem with some of these ancient breeds and why they've become so rare and they're not sort of actively sought after by sheep farmers, is because they adapt so well to the conditions that they live in, and they will adapt to whatever food is available, and then their coats will adapt to the environment and to the food that they're eating. And so these sheep are brown, and it's considered more desirable for commercial purposes to have a white fleece, because of course it can be dyed any color. I thought that was really interesting. And Icelandic sheep are an ancient breed too, and they have adapted to their environment and their location. That's how they have this very specific type of coat that is used in Icelandic wool, and it's very different from other sorts of wools. And those mittens that I've been going on about for the past month or so, that are from sort of Maine and the maritime provinces of Canada, the sheep from Newfoundland adapted, were there for several hundred years, again, adapted to their environment, and they grew coats that were quite different from the sheep that were grown in Europe, which had much finer fleeces and could be spun into much finer wool. And so the stranded colorwork mittens that were knit in Northern Europe tended to be really fine yarns and fine gauges, where in Newfoundland, when they've got these sheep that have adapted to their environment and the wool is coarser and it's just a different kind of fleece, that's what they had to make their yarn with. And so their mittens were not made from these really fine yarns at fine gauges. They're worsted weight wools instead. So it's kind of they had the same color patterns that were adapted to deal with the difference in gauges. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.